Shalom. We're here in Jerusalem today, Sunday, August 11th, 2013, Hey Be'elul, with Rebbetzin Tziporah Heller in Yerushalayim. First of all, Rebbetzin Heller, how do you prefer to be called?
Rebbetzin Heller is good, and Tziporah is good. However you call me is good.
Thank you. Following my theme in this interview is how do you see the transmission of the old tradition, which was our elders' job, where family had Zaydas and Bubis, who infused us with the Jewish way?
Unfortunately, the world that we live in today is one in which most kids under the age of 20 do not have an observant Baba or Zayda. They have memories that came through their Babas and Zayda of their Babas and Zaydas. But for the most part, they know very little, their parents don't know much more, and even their grandparents grew up in America, went to public school, didn't have the opportunity to see life as it was before the level of assimilation culturally and intellectually that we experience today became part of the social reality. So we have to create the imagery of Babis and Zaydis who they didn't actually have.
Babas and the Zaydis were a tool to transmit tradition.
Absolutely.
Those who don't know about Babas and Zaydis don't even know what they're missing. So how do you start the ball rolling?
What I've seen again and again is that if somebody could tell them a story about their own life or about the life of their actual Babi, their actual Zaydi, but something that takes the kids beyond the little frame that they know, it touches their hearts and it broadens them.
Would you be, for the purpose of this discussion, be the Babis for all of the people who didn't have one?
I'll try to transmit whatever I can.
Tell us, how do you remember yourself as a Jewish child, and where do you remember yourself feeling God independently for the first time?
I always had a sense of God. I remember as a very young child, I was an only child, my mother had to leave the house very briefly, and I had heard the word abandoned. I don't remember where I heard it any longer, probably on TV. And I thought, what if my mother abandoned me? And she just left, and I wasn't thinking rationally, but I felt, you know, it depends on God. Now, I couldn't have been more than 3 years old or so at that time, but I always had a sense of God. Did
you have a Zaydi or a Baba?
My father's parents were not observant. I never knew my grandfather. He had died before I was born. And his mother, we called her Baba Leika. She was Russian. She grew up under the communists. My father sang in the Workmen's Circle choir in Madison Square Garden on May 1st. But she was very Jewish. They spoke Yiddish. They had a Seder. They didn't know much about what was going on in the Seder. The ritual was that the children of the family, myself and my cousin Larry, had to ask the 4 questions. Nobody had any idea of what the answers were. And then we'd eat matzah. It was very Jewish. And I remember, again, with that side of the family, my mother's family was different. My mother's family was traditional. But my Aunt Esther, she was a great aunt, and I wanted to get a present out of her. And I began telling her, you know, it's December, and there are big sales, and, you know, and in school, you know, we made these stockings, and you could put gifts in them. And she said, you don't believe any of this, do you? So I said, well, I don't know. So she began to tell me about what Christmas was in the shtetl and how they dreaded it, because that's when you had to double latch the door from the inside and put the heavy bureau against the door. And that's when you had to hide the girls in the baidim, which was the upstairs sort of attic. And this is when the peasants would riot under the faithful guidance of the priests. And that was the beginning of what I would consider to be myself seeing that I'm coming from a different place, not the place of the general culture. And again, I would have had to have been very, very young at the time.
Jewish tradition is a gateway maybe to a more formal belief and practice. When did that happen?
Well, my mother's family was traditional, which is a whole other story. And whatever I learned in school, I was in an observant school from the time I was in the 7th grade. Anything I learned from my mother's perspective was wonderful. Saying blessings on food, Shabbos, in a way that was more specific and more halachic than the Shabbos she knew. All of that was good. Anything that was traditional was good.
So you grew comfortable with religion and Judaism, and you had a choice. Many people today grow up without any support in the Yiddishkeit, and they don't even have a choice. How do you bridge
they don't
this?
know anything.
How do you bridge this gap?
So again, in my mother's family, which was traditional, I didn't know my grandparents. They had both died before I was born. So the way my choices developed was through my being exposed to information. The only way young people are going to get anywhere today in terms of allegiance to Judaism that means anything is through education.
You mean
it's not
Jewish
going
education.
to come Jewish education. It will not come reliably through tradition. It will come through education.
Jewish education sounds very nice, but many people have different associations. Some people have a nostalgic idea of cheder because they have nothing, and some people have an image of a rabbi chasing them down the corridor in yeshiva saying, "Where's your tzitzis?" So we
Nobody under 30 has those images anymore. I don't know if that's good or bad. It could be that for every rabbi who chased the little boy down the corridor saying, "Where's your tzitzis?" there was another rabbi who gave him candy aleph beis. But today, Kenneth, who lives in the suburb, doesn't know either one of them. He goes to public school or to a private, non-affiliated school. They know nothing Jewishly. They don't know that Shabbos is every week. They don't know that Yom Kippur has something to do with forgiveness. They think it's a fast.
How do you teach your grandchildren differently than how your parents raised you?
My grandchildren are in an entirely different frame. Their parents have Jewish education. They grow up with all of this in their blood. They go to observant schools where tradition is taught with a great deal of love and higher consciousness from the time that they're 3. And 3 is already old.
In trying to connect to your inspiring side, I ask you to share with us your sense of love of God. What is loving God, and how can you love a God who is so omnipotent, so powerful?
You can't love something totally unknown. The more you let your eyes open and say how small we are and how beloved we are, how much we're given, the taste, the texture, the feel of food, and I'm going to something that's very visceral, very present in our lives. The more we could feel like beloved children, the more you look at God and nature and you see His wisdom, you see the intricacy of what He made, but you don't just look at the apple and say, "Oh, what an apple." You say, the life force that's there, the wisdom that's there, so that you're loving the creator of the apple and not just the apple, is the beginning of the gate. But just beginning, so here's a gate. What makes anyone love anyone is giving to them. That's why parents love their children so much more than children love their parents. So when you begin to serve God and not just see the apple but say the blessing, you feel enormous connection.
Talking about the relationship.
The relationship, exactly.
The serving and relationship is not instinctively similar to somebody who's not familiar with Jewish
exactly,
practice.
which is why, again, I realize how redundant I'm being. But the most important thing, since their parents know very little, the most important decision that people can make collectively is to do whatever they can to provide people with Jewish education, whether it's through classes, whether it's through sponsoring the schools, but nothing else does anything close.
When I asked you about loving God who is so omnipotent, you used the words small and beloved together. Yes. And it's very difficult to see them both. If I'm small, like an ant, then I don't see how we are beloved. If I love my grandchildren, they are huge in my eyes. Small and beloved sound like a contradiction.
So I'll give you a contrast. Picture 2 kids getting birthday presents. One of them is an 8-year-old who lives in LA, and the other is an 8-year-old who just came from Ethiopia. If you give an 8-year-old who just came from Ethiopia his own apple that he doesn't have to share, he'll be full of joy because he realizes what an apple is. When you realize our lives are very short, Our abilities are very limited, and God showers us with so much. What human could have invented purple? What human could have invented the taste of chocolate? God gives us so much, and here we are, 70 years old, 60 years old, 50 years old, 10 years old, 90 years old. We're beloved because we're small. He gives us far more than we could ever pay for.
So you're saying we don't deserve it, but we get so much more than what we deserve.
Yes, out of love. Out of love. Smallness
is that we get more than what we imagine.
Yeah, it has to do with being humble as opposed to being in a situation where you have a strong sense of entitlement and an artificial sense of one's own presence with a capital P.
So being humble and beloved sounds better than small and beloved. I like that. Well, you remind me an idea that I've heard expanded from the imagery of God's relationship with us has many parallels. One is Av v'banim, a father and children. One is Melech and Avadim, a king and slave. And one says Ohev or Ahuv and Ahuvim, a lover and beloved. Can you expand on those seemingly different and yet intertwined concepts?
So even as humans, we're many things, sometimes even to the same people. So I'm a mother, but I'm also a teacher, I'm also a wife, I'm also a friend, I'm also a parent. So having many roles means that you address the specific aspect of yourself to the person with whom you're interacting that matches their need. A parent doesn't need, a child needs a parent, not an employer. But someone who's working for you needs somebody who'll employ them and pay them and give them a definable assignment, not a mommy. A girlfriend doesn't need from you what a husband needs, nor does a husband want or need what you give to a girlfriend. So when you're talking about Hashem being a king, I want you to realize there was a book written, I think, in the late 60s by Erich Fromm, Escape from Freedom. Look who we follow. Look at the amount of energy that people put into deciding who to vote for in political elections. It's because we all want to be part of something bigger than ourselves, but who do we have? We know who we have. I admire some of the leaders of today's world, but I don't mistake them for God. So when I think God is a king, someone worth following, somebody who's just, who's real, who's truthful, who has all of the power to do whatever he wants. I want to be on that team. That's what God the King means. There are other times when Hashem shows himself to be the merciful parent. There are other times when Hashem shows himself as the one who will not let us self-destroy and won't enable us to do so. He'll put on the brakes and the boundaries. Everything depends on what's needed at the time.
This is a beautiful imagery, but why can't he incorporate them at the same time? Meaning, my child, I'm trying to discipline him, and he starts crying, my heart breaks, I'm going to kind of remove the discipline for the second and show him that I love him at the same time.
They're all one. Every day we say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. The Zohar says anyone who thinks that the qualities are separate and each has their own sort of orbit, that person isn't even a monotheist. But you have to be willing to see it. The child who's being punished, even if the parent relents for a moment, may not see it because they're so absorbed in the fact that they aren't getting what they want. I use the word enabling. If you have the case of, let's say, a man who's alcoholic and whose wife says, I will not be there for you until you start taking care of yourself, till you join AA. I'm leaving. She's doing the kindest thing possible. Now, if she looks back and says, but not really, maybe tomorrow, that's not the way to go if she cares about him.
It's leadership. Well, you mentioned people that you admire and you follow, so picking on this lead, which rabbis or leaders have influenced you?
Oh, so many, and in so many different ways. So to give you a couple of examples, and they're all different from each other. When around 30 years ago or so, Rav Elyashiv was not yet as famous as he was towards the latter part of his life. He was very available, and he was an encyclopedia. But he was able to maintain such egolessness. You could ask him any question, and you never knew his thoughts inside himself or his feelings. You knew the Torah. It was as close as talking to a Sefer Torah as you can get. He was speaking from a place of absolute truth and no emotional agenda. It was something amazing to see. Another rabbi whose approach was very different, but equally as beautiful and moving, was Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. I once had to take a student to him who had to describe the fact that she was raped. Now, when I took her there, I knew that he would have to ask her for details, and I assumed he would say, "Could you please tell me the details of what happened?" That's not what happened. He leaned over. He had a very characteristic pose like this, with his hand on his chin. He said, "It must be like a nightmare." And she said, "Yes," and she began to cry. And he was right with her. He said, "Where did it happen?" Not only was he sensitive, but he asked every one of the questions he had to find out to be able to make a halachic decision without her knowing she was being questioned. He was like an artist. He was amazing. So many rabbis have shown me different aspects of what, in a certain sense, divinity is through the prism of how their souls showed through the Torah within them.
You're describing great Rebbeim and great
Yes.
qualities. And there are many great Rebbeim,
Yes,
thank God.
yes, yes.
How does a person choose a Rebbe? And did you have one?
It's very hard to choose a Rebbe. Somebody once asked the great Chazon Ish, who died in 1954, to give you an idea of his genre, why today there are so many different paths? You know, if you were to go back to Maimonides' time, you either did the Torah, in which case, if you did it perfectly, you would end up a great tzaddik, or you didn't do it, and if you did everything wrong, you would end up as a wicked person. Or you were just struggling along there like everybody else, and there were no labels. There was no Hasidic, and no Yeshivish, and no modern Orthodox. Why do we need all these labels today? And he said, because today our egos are so fragile that we need to find somebody who resonates with who we are. We don't stretch to meet the rabbi. We have to find the rabbi who's similar enough that we find some resonance.
Validation.
Some validation, or at least understanding. So a Rav who I had the merit to know was Rav Freifeld, who could make anybody feel totally understood. And I remember the first time I went to him. He gave a class, and of course what he said was unlike anything I had ever heard before. And I went to him after the class with a few questions. He invited me to his home. Now, I was going there to observe him. And I'm a very private person. I don't give that much of myself. So he said, "So what do you have to say?" So I said, "I don't have anything to say." And he waited until I would at least say something so that he could let me know that he heard me. I know that he once, someone was bringing him to a young man, a Jewish fellow, who had no spiritual education within Judaism, so he ended up living with the American Indians. The Rav spent significant hours reading up on American Indian spiritual practice so he would understand who he was talking to.
That's wonderful. You're a halachic woman, meaning that you obey the halacha, the laws pertaining to Judaism and the letter of the law.
Mm-hmm.
You're also a very spiritual person. What is the relationship between spiritual and halachic?
The word halacha means the way to walk. You could have so much energy, but if you have no direction, where are you going? If I met someone in the street and they said, "Could you give me directions?" I would say, "Where are you going?" If they say, "I don't know," I can't help them. The function of halacha is to give a conduit to all of the spiritual energy that you have through the precision and through the transcendental will that flows through the specific nature of halacha.
So you're hitting on exactly the point, which is today we confuse spiritualism with how I feel. What does it feel to be Jewish? And yet I cannot go with what I feel. Please, if you can elaborate on the spiritual direction.
So I'm going to give you two examples of what I mean. Let's take the laws of visiting the sick. Not everybody likes to be in a hospital. Not everybody wants to take off time from their life to get there. Not everybody likes the smells and the sights that come at them when they go to the hospital. So to say I'm a person who loves bonding, who's kind, who's giving, but I'll only give if it makes me feel good, is where the halacha doesn't want to take you. The halacha takes you to virgin territory, territory where you wouldn't go on your own. So for a person who doesn't like the hospital, going to see someone in the hospital because they need them is where halacha takes you. I could tell you another example of that with halacha, charity. The halacha requires that you give 10% of your net earnings, assuming you have earnings, to charity. Now, I'm not an evil person. I would give charity no matter what, I'm sure. $50 here, $20 there. I would never give thousands of dollars a year except for this, that the halacha requires it. It takes me where I wouldn't go on my own. Now, an unrelated example of this would be, I have a friend, she's a professional, she's an extremely intelligent and creative person. She raised her 2 children alone. She considers herself to be a very good mother. She tells them stories, she's exciting to be with, she'll take them on trips. That's not how they see her, and I want to tell you why. She wasn't there for them when they needed her. She was there for them when she wanted to be with them. When she wanted to go to meetings, professional meetings, that were distant from where they live, and she also wanted to see the country, and the kids would be for 3 weeks in my home. Even though they like me, and they like my kids, and they like my home, they wanted the stability of a home. And she was giving them what she wanted to give them, but not what they needed to receive. And the reason for this is that there was no structure forcing her to go beyond self, which is what halacha does.
That's very insightful within the life of a Jew. A lot of people think that their Judaism is how they feel. They think if they have a latke, or they have chicken soup, or if they light candles, or if they have a seder, then that's being Jewish, which is beautiful. But is Judaism what makes you feel Jewish, or is Judaism a very strict code?
Judaism is meant to be both living and transformative. So if a person is eating latkes, there's a limit to how much that's going to transform them. There's a limit to how far they'll grow from that experience. It's positive, it creates some level of identity, but it's not transformative, and it doesn't take them very far. The only thing that takes people further and transforms them is the Torah and the mitzvot. So because of this, every person should be able to say on Rosh Hashanah, next year I'll be wiser, next year I'll be frummer. Obviously everybody has their own pace, that's as it should be. But if a person is static, then they're not practicing living Judaism.
Well, that's very interesting, because we believe from the outside that Judaism demands of us. It's like this, demanding force that we have to constantly sacrifice. And you're saying that actually Judaism, the more you are in it, the more you get, the more you're transformed. Mm-hmm. What's the difference between transformative and receiving?
The difference is this. If you're in the army, in Israel, they give you a little book at the beginning that's called the Mifkadah. And it says, here's how we do it in the army. This is how we make the bed, and this is how we clean the gun, and this is how we get dressed, and this is how we eat breakfast. So there's a concept called Kabbalat Ol, which means you're in relationship. And if you're in your relationship, you can't only be self-serving. This is how God said it. There's value in that inherently. However, having said that, unlike the army where some of the rules objectively make sense and some of them don't, God is in no need of telling us to do anything. God only will give us instructions that take us to a place beyond self, that get us higher and closer and deeper in relationship. So the mitzvot have both intrinsic meaning, and they also give us a sense of Kabbalat Ol, a sense of going beyond self. So receiving means that you're getting the benefit of relationship, and the benefit of growth.
Going to a different direction, what characters in the Mikra, in the Tanakh, are your heroes?
Yosef HaTzadik, who faced temptation and nobody was there to give him a good mark for doing what's right. But I want to tell you what moves me the most about Yosef HaTzadik, even more than this. The Gemara tells us that he thought he failed his test because although his master's wife was trying to seduce him and he did not submit to her seductions, he wanted her. He had arousal. He wanted her. He had to overcome himself. But he thought that he transgressed the 10th commandment, which is, don't covet someone's wife. So he thought he was doomed anyway, but he still did what was right, because for him, it was never about reward and punishment.
Doing the right thing.
Yeah.
You described so many streams and directions in Judaism today. How would you define yourself? Are you more of a chassid?
I try my very best to be halachic, and I don't belong to any particular group.
Right. You chose to live in Israel, in Jerusalem, and it's not so simple. How did you choose and how is it working?
Well, I came to study after high school and seminary. I met my husband. We went back to New York to get married. We came back here for 2 years. That was the plan. And we never went back, basically, except for visits. So I can't say that we ever decided to come on Aliyah. In fact, it was only after we were here something like 9 years when we realized, in fact, we had gone through our Aliyah rights and we're here. You know, we may as well cash in on whatever is left, which wasn't much. But to me, like how anybody could find life outside of Israel anywhere near as exciting, as intense, as spiritually dramatic, as enjoyable as life in Israel is beyond me.
I hear you lead very inspiring classes. What do you draw the inner power to give your whole? Where does one draw inspiration altogether, and where do you find it in your head, in your heart, in your soul? Tell us more about it.
Don't know myself, I have to tell you. It's all help from Hashem. I can't give you a better answer than that.
We are here in Neve Yerushalayim. You teach women. And without going into controversial issues, can you tell us about the role of women in today's practice of Judaism?
So every woman is a woman and a person, and if you're talking about Jewish women, and a Jew. These roles were never conflicted. Being a Jew means being in relationship to Hashem through the mitzvot. Being a woman makes it possible to do this through relationship, primarily through relationship and communication, which are women's strongest points. The halacha allows her exemptions from many, many other areas to allow her the free flow of communication and relationship being her core. This doesn't make her less human or less Jewish. It just gives an expression for her feminine side as well.
But today, women want more of a role in the practice of Judaism in synagogue or in public Jewish life.
My observation, again, is very subjective. I haven't yet personally, now I'm not saying this doesn't exist, I only could tell you through my own eyes. I haven't met people who maxed out, I can't think of a nicer word, on prayer, who find the traditional role constricting. If you go to the Kotel early in the morning for the earliest tefillah, on the bus that leaves from Har Nof and goes through the religious neighborhoods, 3/4 of the people on the bus are women. They're there for the nates. They're there every day. If you go to the Kotel at 12 midnight for Nishmat, there are a lot of women there. Women in prayer are like this in the observant community. They don't feel that they have to pray stylistically like men do in order to pray. Unfortunately, in the less observant community, prayer equals formalism. Synagogue is where the power is. In the more observant community, prayer itself is where the power is, and the formalism is not that big. Some women find it even rather misogynistic to say that your prayer is not important or as valid or as something unless you imitate men. What could be more misogynistic? It's like telling a black person, You can't be beautiful unless you straighten your hair and lighten your skin.
There's no real halachic restriction, and yet we are subject to some confusion about what is really the halachic defining parameters. And that's where part of the struggle is.
So I want to tell you something that happened quite a number of years ago when the Women of the Wall first became a public movement. I'm not political, so I didn't come to the wall when they were there for any particular reason, except that it was Rosh Chodesh and I was there anyway. And at that point, it was illegal for them to make their prayer book, prayer group, as a public sort of anti-halacha statement. So the rabbi of the Kotel then, who is not the current rabbi, instructed some policewomen to tell them to move on. So they formed a protest circle, which is such an American thing. They sat on the floor in a circle and wouldn't move. Now I want you to be an Israeli policewoman or a soldier. Maybe 19, maybe you're Aliza, maybe you're from Gadeva, maybe from a moshav. You have not seen an adult woman sit on the floor in a circle like this. It was like going back to Gan. So they didn't quite know what to do with it. And I saw, they're standing there smoking, not knowing what to do with the women. And I realized this isn't going, this is the eye of the storm. Soon the beggar ladies at the Kotel are going to get involved and they'll be screaming and yelling. So I figured I want to save the day and keep it quiet. So I went to one of the women who appeared to be a leader, a Canadian woman. I said, look, I don't think what you think, you don't think what I think. Let's go to a halachic expert and find out what's permitted, what's forbidden, and then we could have dialogue that has some meaning. So she agreed to go with me to Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. So I purposely didn't make an appointment. I just went with her on the bus because I knew he hated being involved in anything controversial. So I knew he wouldn't have given us an appointment. So I just showed up with her. So he said, what's the issue? And I said, well, there is this movement, the Women of the Wall. He said, ask the rabbi of the Kotel. He wanted out, but I didn't move. I stood there in his study and just didn't go anywhere. So he realized he had to deal with this. So he asked her what the issues are, and she said exactly what her questions were concerning Kriyat Torah, Kaddish, various other things. He listened to her extremely attentively, permitted things that I did not know were permitted, but then I saw it coming. He's there. And he looked at her and he said, but why do you want to pray so much? Is there something terrible happening in your life that you really have to pour yourself out to God? What's happening? Now, she could have just said yes and left, but she was honest. She was very straight. She said no. So he said, so what are you doing this for? So he said, because I want more of a role. And she was so straight. She really let herself be vulnerable. She said, I'm 35, I'm not married, I don't feel like I have a role as a woman in Judaism, so I want to have more of a feeling of community. So he said, so it's not about prayer. And she was honest enough to say, no, it's about community. And he said, I want to ask you two a halachic question. So I knew this was going to be good. So he turned to both of us and he said, are you allowed to daven Shemona Esrei with a cat on your shoulder? So she looks at me and says, do you know why he's asking that? I said, no. And he says, are you allowed to? So finally, I said, we don't know. Okay. So he said, it doesn't say anywhere in any book of halacha that a woman shouldn't daven Shemona Esrei with a cat on her shoulder. There's no chapter in which animals on your shoulder is under discussion. But anybody who understands Shemona Esrei understands you don't daven with a cat on your shoulder. So anyone who understands a woman knows that a woman isn't a tzibor. It says in the Gemara, 1,000 women are always 1,000 individuals. And he left us with that. So the issue of finding specific leniencies for defined halachas, nobody would have trouble with that if it was about prayer. The problem is that it's about politic and it's about transferring roles. in a way that ultimately puts the traditional role of being a woman as well as a person way in the shade.
Well, thank you for this very deep understanding. You're touching on halacha, and I want to understand, is halacha rigid? Is halacha changing? And how does halacha change? We know that we don't practice the same way that we practiced 400 years ago, and we know there's been a lot of transformation, but how does it happen?
So in this past week's parsha it says, "And you shall listen to the sage of your time and not depart from what they say to the right or to the left." When people therefore ask this halacha change, if you take about questions, there are always new questions arising. So in Igrot Moshe, for instance, Rav Moshe Feinstein had to determine the halachic answers to many questions that were not on the roster in the time of the Gemara. Artificial insemination, the halachic status of an adopted child, is playing football, which is a violent sport, permitted? So if you were to take his answer to playing football, his way of approaching the question would be, what does the halacha define as danger? And only once you know that, 8 pages later, could you begin to talk about where football fits into it. In the end, his answer was play. But it wasn't coming from his gut. Nobody cares what his gut is. So one of the tests that the members of the Sanhedrin had to pass was being able to find many reasons to say why in specific circumstances even eating an insect would be permitted. The question is, why do they have to know this? And who cares about what the Sanhedrin says anyway? So that means that the great Sanhedrin, which had the tradition still from Moshe throughout the period of till the end of the Second Temple period, were the repository of the law, not because humans can't make a mistake, but because it's Hashem's will that we argue out the principles that were given to Moshe. And the rule is you always go by the majority opinion. If there are 10 reasons to say permitted and only 2 reasons to say forbidden, the answer is permitted, but you must know the 2 reasons that would say forbidden. Why? So there are circumstances in which we're supposed to go by minority opinion. That would include danger to life, major loss, the sake of peace, and preserving the integrity of Torah. So historically, for those 4 reasons, if there's an existent leniency, not play it like you like, if there's an existent leniency, you may go by that leniency, again, to save life, prevent major loss, the sake of peace, or to preserve the integrity of the Torah. An example of that would be writing down the oral law. So when you have people saying something like, where there's rabbinic will, there's halachic way, what they're really saying is, I want you to make halachic decisions based on my gut. There's no history of making halacha happen on that basis.
But today we have so many rabbanim that we cannot even agree on what chickpea is allowed to be eaten, what bread is allowed to be eaten, what chicken is allowed to be eaten. I'm not talking about the mechanics of the law, but really the spirit of Jewish Achdut, and we are in a fragmented world.
We are since the Holocaust, and this is a great tragedy, and it's not likely to get better any time in the immediate future. In the pre-Holocaust world, there was tradition that evolved that people knew from where they lived. In the post-Holocaust world, everything is fragmented. In Israel, much more fragmented than elsewhere. Sfardim and Ashkenazim and this and that, and I don't see it getting better in the immediate future. And it's predicted that this is how it will be before Mashiach. It says, Emet ne'ederet min ha'aretz. The Gemara says that will be adarim will be like little flocks, and I see every flock getting progressively smaller, not more united. And Maharal explains that the reason why we tend towards this fragmentation is because Jews, by the nature of things, want to do things right and love truth. If you have your little piece of truth that resonates, it's very hard for you to be tolerant of somebody else's truth.
It's a beautiful spin to make something look so positive. I'll go to the total opposite direction from halacha, and it's Kabbalah. I heard you talk about Kabbalah, and it was immensely clear in comparison. What is the role of Kabbalah?
When the Torah was given, it was given in more than one dimension. The multidimensional nature of Torah is called pardes. So pshat is the simple meaning of the text. For instance, don't murder means don't murder. You have to have a definition of murder as opposed to killing. You have to know under what circumstances that would work, what the witnessing would be, what the punishment would be, etc. One step inward, you have what's called remez. What do the words themselves allude to? Where else are these words used? What's their gematria? What is it telling you this for? A level that's deeper than that is called drush, which means searching for the meaning of it. Why not murder? What's so sacred about human life? And then finally you have sod, which relates us to the soul and to God, which is what Kabbalah is, which is God is the God of life. What does that mean? What aspect of God is within people? Is that what makes murder so heinous a crime? So when Moshe gave over the Torah, he gave over all the levels. Okay, because there are many reasons which go beyond the scope of your question of why much of the Torah was retained orally. Okay, certainly the sod, the intimacy of Torah, which could only be truly experienced after you go through the other levels, there was great reluctance to write anything of that down. The Zohar, nonetheless, was put down in scroll form in the time of the end period of the Second Temple. It was elucidated by the Arizal, edited by Rav Moshe de Leon, and brought down to a level that ordinary people could understand something of these depths through the Hasidic masters and to a lesser degree through some of the Sfardi Chachamim.
Is Kabbalah the connection between what's godly in humans?
Yeah.
In a more mechanical way?
No. It's like you see the king from a distance. So the first thing you see is the robe and the crowns. Okay, without that you can't identify the person as the king. You get a little bit closer, you see his face. You get a little bit closer, you could see his body and the form of his body under his robes. You get a little bit closer, you could touch him. Okay, so that's the progression of Pshat till Kabbalah.
That's very clear. In light of the fact that God is so merciful, caring, and all good, how do you explain human pain? I know people like to ask about the Holocaust, but I'm not distinguishing between how many people got hurt. I'm asking about one person losing a child, losing a parent, losing their job, losing their arm.
Yes.
Just pain. How can God allow this?
So I would go further than saying allow it, because allow it suggests that there's an opposing force, which there isn't. There's a parable. Once there was a king, and the king had a son. And the king wanted the son to be acknowledged by everyone as being worthy of kingship. So he decided to turn the son into a hero. So he had to give him a feat that he could overcome. He decided against giving him a physical feat because it doesn't prove anything about his true value on a human level. And in any case, what you could do at 20, you can't do at 50. So he gave him a moral challenge. This king had a beautiful concubine who loved him very much. He said to the concubine, "Go tempt my son." So if the concubine really, really loved the king, should she tempt the son or shouldn't she try to tempt the son? What should she do? What do you think?
I think that's you don't cross the line.
So it's a parable from the Zohar, and the parable says if she truly loved the king, she would try to seduce the son because she identifies with his will, but she doesn't want to succeed. So her moment of defeat, when the son says, "Get out of here, what do you think you're doing?" That's the moment of her triumph. Hashem wants people to be heroic, which means that they have to have choices that have depth and meaning. When you look at anyone who anyone considers a hero, they're a hero because of the depth of their challenges. So the presence of concealment and evil and pain, all of this is what determines what challenges. I'll give you an example of this. It's a story many people who hear this probably heard. But the Mir Yeshiva is presently the largest yeshiva in the world. So fundraising is a nightmare. So there's a team of fundraisers. One of the fundraisers heard of some American businessmen who were coming to Israel, and he decided to get them somehow to see the yeshiva. And his feeling was, no matter what, this could only be good. So this included the fellow who owns Starbucks. So they get to the yeshiva. There was a misunderstanding. They thought that they were supposed to be in the yeshiva 2210. They were going to meet the Rosh Yeshiva and see the yeshiva and have an explanation of what study is all about. And the whole thing, how much time do you think the whole thing is supposed to take? 20 minutes. Okay, that's how much time they have for this on their schedules. So the Rosh Yeshiva first came 20 after 10, which is when he thought he was supposed to be there. So the fundraiser had to keep them entertained for like all of this time. So they weren't in good spirits when he came. And you know how you could see when a person walks into a room, you could see from other people's responses whether there's connection. So I don't know what they thought a Rosh Yeshiva should look like. You know, maybe tall and with a long white beard and very noble looking. This was towards the end of Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel's life. He had Parkinson's. He, at best, didn't look that great. Okay, he came in, sat down, and he began speaking to them. But when he would shake, his voice would wobble with emotion, so it was hard to understand him. You had to be very focused to understand him. And these guys were like not in the mood. And there are some people anyway when they see somebody with disabilities, like they're not comfortable. So one of them already took out his checkbook he just wanted out. The Rosh Yeshiva banged on the table hard, and he said, "Look at me." So they did. And he said, "What did you learn from the Holocaust?" And they didn't know what to say. So one of them tried, he said, "We learned that we shouldn't allow such a thing to happen again," which even as he was saying it, he realized what a stupid thing this was to say. It isn't as though the people then wanted it to happen. They didn't know what to say. So he said, "I want to tell you something." At the end, when the Germans realized they were losing the war, they accelerated the rate of destruction they were trying to do, to the point where at the very end, trains were coming into Auschwitz once every 8 minutes, if you could imagine such a thing. And when the people would get off, some people were sent to the left, some to the right, and even if those who were sent to the right, who had at least a temporary hold on life, every 5th person was given a blanket. So he said to them, "If you were there then, and you're here today, what would you rather say? I shared my blanket with 4 other people, or I kept it myself. What would you rather say?" What do you think they said?
Shared it.
So they all said, "I would like to have said that I shared my blanket." So he got up and he said, "I wish you every blessing. Go back to America, succeed in what you do, but share the blanket." So what he was getting across is the true nobility could only come in the place of choice. And choice, the price you pay for choice is pain.
Out of the confusion that's an assimilation, what would you tell a person who you meet for an hour about his being Jewish, and why is it worth it for him to preserve it, and why observe rather than just belong?
So the 2 things I would try to get across is that every moral system feeds off Judaism. What people today call the Judeo-Christian ethic comes straight out of Parshas Kedoshim, and that before you trade the cornerstone of morality for something else, at least know what it is. And why they should observe rather than belong, I would tell them openly, you could only know that after you see 2 pictures. You know what it is not to observe, but you don't know what it is to observe. Find out a little bit more, observe a bit, and then make a decision.
Have a choice.
Have a choice.
So about that, I asked my son if you had one question, and he had said, "Can one make deals with God?"
So the answer is yes, but with a big but. The Gemara says that Iyun Tefillah is marvelous. That means being prayer with every part of you that's investigative, that's your mind is there. It's a good thing. It's one of the things, she'ein lehem shir, there's no limit. Turn the page, it says Iyun Tefillah is terrible. So what is it? There are 2 kinds of Iyun Tefillah. One is where you say, Hashem, you're the master of all things, I'm reliant only on you. Okay, so from that place, of course you can make deals, because Hashem is the only one who can give you anything. How could you not make a deal? You're the only one who can give me another moment of life. However, if you think that you control Hashem by making a deal, then you've crossed lines in which you don't really believe in Hashem at all, you believe in yourself.
I heard Rav Adin Steinzel recently mention the Jew as the radioactive material in the world that makes change, makes things happen. What is your idea of the Jew's role in the world? And since we have limited time, what is Tikkun Olam while we're at it?
So Tikkun Olam is, in fact, means rectifying the world. It's a phrase that's been sort of hijacked by segments of Jewish leaders who don't believe that much in observance, but it actually comes from the Vilna Gaon, who his idea of Tikkun Olam was living a life through which you change things. So nothing changes the consciousness of the world towards seeing every other person as God's creation, the way keeping Shabbos does, where you say there's a creator through your actions. Okay? Just talking doesn't do what action does. Wherever Jews have kept Torah, you have some sort of an imprint that's left indelibly. That's why life in New York is very different than life in Uganda. So the critical mass of Jews keeping Torah is something that makes everything happen in the world. And indeed, the effect of Jews on the world, as I said before, the Judeo-Christian ethic, which is what people consider to be basic morality, is something that we've spread to one degree or another, each person in a different way wherever we've been. It flowed to the world through the effect we've had on non-Jews through Islam, through Christianity. It flowed through the labor unions, which were Jewishly found, through psychology, which was Jewishly found, through communism, which was Jewishly found. But the core of care about the other person because he's in God's image, that's Judaism. Tov, so I wish you a lot of hatzlacha.
Thank you so much.